Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, en Bogotá, Colombia, transmite UMNG Radio. UMNG Radio. Una emisora alternativa, cultural e independiente. Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Esta es UMNG Radio.
Tune in and speak up. Hello, English learners. Want to learn something interesting whilst having fun? Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast where you'll get to know this beautiful language in depth. Each week, we'll dive into exciting topics, share practical tips, and tell you fascinating English language stories. So whether you're studying, going to work, or just relaxing, connect, listen, and let's make English part of your world. Wherever you are, whenever you want, just hit play, tune in and listen up. Tune in to UMNG Radio every Tuesday from 11 a.m. till noon. Don't just learn English, live it.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast from Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, where we explore curious stories, surprising facts, and cultural insights from around the world, all through the lens of English learning. This is the podcast where unusual moments from history and culture become your classroom for practicing English. I'm Jorge Bermudez, teacher of English at the Department of Multicultural Studies at UMNG, part of the School of Education and Humanities. I'll be your guide through some of the most unexpected and thought-provoking topics, from forgotten inventions and everyday objects to strange ideas that quietly changed the way we live. Whether you're learning English as a second language or simply enjoy discovering how culture and history shape our daily lives, this podcast is for you. So, if you're ready to improve your listening skills, expand your vocabulary, and explore the hidden stories behind ordinary things, grab your headphones, tune in, and let's speak up. Today, in our episode number 7 of the third season, facing ourselves for the first time. We're going to be talking about the invention of mirrors. Let's go to the first slide. Okay, every day, we look into mirrors without thinking twice. We check our appearance, adjust our posture, make faces, or avoid our reflection altogether. The mirror feels ordinary, almost invisible. And yet, for most of human history, seeing oneself clearly was impossible. Before mirrors, humans knew their faces only through shadows, water, or the descriptions of others. Identity was something felt, not observed. The invention of the mirror quietly changed that. It changed how humans understood the body. It changed how artists represented reality. It changed how scientists studied light and vision. And perhaps most profoundly, it changed how people thought about the self. This episode explores how mirrors evolved from polished stone and metal to glass backed with silver, and how this simple object became loaded with meaning. Mirrors have symbolized truth and deception, vanity and wisdom, knowledge and danger. They appear in myths, religious texts, scientific experiments, and everyday rituals. From ancient obsidian mirrors in Mesoamerica to Renaissance workshops in Venice, from optical laboratories to modern psychology, mirrors have always existed at the intersection of technology and identity. They do more than reflect faces. They reflect how humans understand who they are. In this episode, we will trace the history of mirrors, not just as objects, but as cultural turning points, and ask a deceptively simple question. What happens when a species finally learns to look at itself? And that takes us to our first segment. Before mirrors, water, stone, and the first reflections. Long before humans learned how to make mirrors, they still encountered their own reflections. But these reflections were unstable, momentary, and imperfect. The earliest mirrors were not objects at all. They were surfaces, still water in a lake, a pond, or a bowl. A reflection could appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly with a ripple, a breeze, or a step too close. These early reflections were mysterious. Seeing oneself in water was not a daily controlled experience. It was accidental. And because it was unreliable, it often carried symbolic weight. In many ancient cultures, reflections in water were associated with spirits, souls, or alternate worlds. The image looked like you, but it wasn't you. This ambiguity mattered. Without a clear distinction between reflection and reality, early humans often interpreted reflections through myth and belief, not science. This is why so many ancient stories link mirrors and reflections to danger, transformation, or self knowledge. Eventually, humans tried to fix their reflection. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as 6000 BCE, that's before the Common Era, our era, people in regions such as Anatolia and Mesopotamia polished pieces of obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass. These black, glossy stones produce dark but recognizable reflections. Later civilizations refined the idea. In ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and Mesoamerica, mirrors were made from polished metals such as copper, bronze, and even gold. These mirrors did not reflect color accurately and distorted features slightly, but they were portable, durable, and intentional. For the first time, humans could choose to see themselves. These early mirrors were valuable objects. They required labor, skill, and resources, which meant they were often associated with status, ritual, and power. In some cultures, mirrors were buried with the dead or used in religious ceremonies, suggesting that reflection was linked not only to appearance, but to identity and the afterlife. Importantly, these mirrors were not neutral tools. Metal mirrors reflected light unevenly. They darkened skin tones, they softened details. They offered a version of the self that was incomplete and informative. What people saw was not an exact image, but an approximation. And yet, that approximation was enough to change behavior. The ability to observe one's face encountered grooming, ornamentation, and self awareness. It influenced how people understood beauty, age, and difference. Even an imperfect mirror created a new relationship between humans and their own bodies. At this stage, mirrors were not about vanity, they were about recognition of the self as something visible, something external, something that could be looked at, reflected upon, and interpreted. This was the first step in a long journey. Before mirrors became clear, before they entered art and science, Before they reshaped identity, they taught humans a simple but unsettling idea. You can be both the one who sees and the one who is seen. And that takes us to our second segment, from craft to knowledge, mirrors and the birth of optics. For centuries, mirrors were made by skilled hands, not by scientific understanding. Early mirrors makers knew how to polish metal or shape glass, but not why reflections behaved the way they did. The mirror worked, but its logic remained mysterious. That began to change when mirrors stopped being seen only as objects and started being studied as phenomena. The turning point came with improvements in glass making. By the Roman period, artisans had learned how to produce clearer glass, though early glass mirrors were still imperfect. They were often backed with lead or tin and reflected light unevenly. Even so, these mirrors marked a shift. Reflection was no longer dark and metallic, but bright and luminous. In medieval Europe and the Islamic world, scholars began asking systematic questions about light. How does light travel? Why do images reverse left and right? Why do curved mirrors distort reality? These questions led to the early foundations of optics. One of the most important figures in this transition was Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazen. In the 11th century, he challenged ancient Greek theories that claimed vision came from rays emitted by the eyes. Instead, he demonstrated that light enters the eye, reflecting off objects, including mirrors. His work treated mirrors not as magical surfaces, but as tools for experimentation. By studying reflection and refraction, scholars began to describe vision mathematically. Mirrors became instruments that could be measured, tested, and repeated. This was a profound change. Reflection moved from belief to observation. At the same time, mirror technology advanced. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, craftsmen in Venice, particularly on the island of Murano, perfected techniques for producing flatter, clearer glass mirrors backed with mercury and tin. These mirrors were expensive and rare, but their quality was unmatched. For the first time, mirrors offered reliable, detailed images. This reliability made them useful not only for personal reflection, but for science, navigation, and art. Mirrors were used in optical devices, early telescopes, and instruments designed to study perspective and proportion. The mirror had become a technology. It no longer simply reflected the world, it helped explain it. This shift laid the groundwork for later scientific revolutions. Thinkers like Johannes Kepler and later Isaac Newton would build on these optical principles, using mirrors and lenses to understand light, color, and motion. What began as craft evolved into knowledge. And in that transformation, the mirror stopped being just a surface. It became a tool for understanding reality itself. And that takes us to our segment 3, Between Worlds, Mirrors, Myths, and Superstition. Ooh. Even as mirrors became clearer and more precise, they never lost their aura of mystery. Across cultures, mirrors have occupied an uneasy space between the real and the unreal. They reproduce the world faithfully, and yet they remain separate from it. This strange duality made mirrors powerful objects in stories, rituals, and beliefs long before science could explain how reflection works. In many societies, mirrors were believed to be connected to the soul. This belief helps explain a widespread custom found in parts of Europe and the Americas, covering mirrors after a person dies, as we can see in the picture. The reflection was thought to risk trapping the soul, confusing it, or preventing it from moving on. Even where the belief faded, the ritual often remained. Superstitions surrounding mirrors also shaped everyday behavior. The idea that breaking a mirror brings 7 years of bad luck dates back to ancient Rome. Romans believed mirrors reflected not just appearance, but a person's vitality and fortune. Because they thought the body renewed itself every 7 years, damaging a mirror meant damaging one's future. And that takes us to our next slide. Between worlds. We continue mirrors, myths, and superstition. In East Asia, mirrors often carried a different kind of power. In ancient China and Japan, mirrors were used as protective objects. It was believed that evil spirits could not face their own reflection and would be driven away by it. In Shinto tradition, the mirror is one of the three sacred treasures of Japan, symbolizing truth, purity, and self knowledge. Mythology reinforces these ideas. The Greek myth of Narcissus, here in the picture by Caravaggio, tells of a young man who falls in love with his reflection in water, unable to recognize it as his own image. The reflection becomes both revelation and trap, a theme that appears again and again in mirror stories. Later fairy tales and legends gave mirrors voices and intentions. Enchanted mirrors could reveal hidden truths, expose vanity, or open doors to other worlds. They were rarely neutral. They knew things humans did not. What connects all these beliefs is not fear of the object itself, it's fear of self confrontation. Mirror, on the wall. A mirror shows an image without explanation. It offers no narrative, no judgment, only presence. This silence invites interpretation, projection, and imagination. Where knowledge is incomplete, myth fills the space. Even today, many of these ideas persist. People still avoid sleeping facing mirrors. They still hesitate before smashing one. They still speak of reflections as if they hold something more than light. Long before mirrors became tools of science or art, they were objects or meaning. And even as science advanced, that meaning never fully disappeared. And that takes us to our next slide. Mirrors as portals between worlds. In many traditions, mirrors were not seen merely as reflected surfaces, but as thresholds, boundaries between one reality and another. Because a mirror creates a world that looks real but cannot be entered, it invited a powerful idea that the reflection was not just an image, but another space, a parallel world that existed behind the glass. This belief appears in ancient, medieval, and modern cultures. In European folklore, mirrors were sometimes described as gateways through which spirits could pass. This helps explain Again, why mirrors were covered at night or during periods of mourning, not only to protect the soul of the dead, but to prevent other presences from crossing over. In Mesoamerican traditions, polished obsidian mirrors were associated with divination and communication with other realms. The Aztec deity Tezcatlipoca, here in the picture, whose name means smoking mirror, was believed to use reflective surfaces to observe and influence the human world. Later literature transformed these beliefs into narrative form. Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass imagines a mirror world governed by inverted logic. In the 20th century, fantasy and science fiction repeatedly returned to the same idea: the mirror as a doorway, a passage into an alternate dimension. What makes this belief so persistent is not technology, but perception. A mirror creates a space that obeys different rules. Left becomes right. Depth exists without distance. Movement occurs without physical presence. To pre-scientific observers, this behavior suggested that the mirror did not merely reflect reality, it contained one. From a psychological perspective, mirrors confront humans with a double self, a familiar yet unreachable other. This experience easily becomes symbolic of parallel identities, hidden selves, or unseen worlds. So when mirrors are described as portals, the belief is less about glass and more about human uncertainty. Uncertainty about where reality ends. Uncertainty about where the self begins. In this way, the mirror does not open a door to another dimension. It reveals how ready humans are to imagine one. And that takes us to our next segment. Looking inward, mirrors and the birth of the self-portrait. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, mirrors had begun to lose some of their mystery, but they gained something else: precision. Advances in glassmaking, especially in Venice, remember, on the island of Murano, produced mirrors that were flatter, brighter, and far more accurate than anything that had existed before. These mirrors were still rare and expensive, but for artists, they offered an unprecedented opportunity. For the first time, a person could study their own face carefully and repeatedly. This technical change coincided with a cultural shift. Renaissance humanism placed new emphasis on the individual, on personal identity, intellect, and self-expression. Artists were no longer anonymous craftsmen working only for religious institutions. They were creators with names, reputations, and distinct styles. The mirror made this new identity visible. Before high-quality mirrors, self-portraits were difficult to produce and often symbolic rather than realistic. With mirrors, artists could observe themselves directly, adjusting light, angle, and expression over long periods of time. One of the earliest and most striking examples is Albrecht Dürer, here in our picture to the left. His self-portraits, especially the famous painting from 1500, present the artist with remarkable confidence and detail. The image is carefully constructed, frontal, and intense, a declaration of self-awareness made possible by the mirror. Other artists followed. Leonardo da Vinci used mirrors as tools for anatomical study and for understanding facial expression. He even wrote notes in mirror script, suggesting a deep engagement with reflection as both a practical and intellectual device. Parmigianino went a step further. In his self-portrait in a convex mirror, here in our slide to the right, he painted himself exactly as he appeared in a curved mirror, embracing distortion rather than hiding it. The painting acknowledges the mirror's presence openly. The tool becomes part of the message. These works represent more than an artistic innovation. They mark a turning point in how humans understood themselves. The self was no longer defined only by social role, religious identities, or lineage. It became something that could be observed, analyzed, and represented. The mirror did not invent individuality, but it gave individuality a face. From this moment on, the act of looking at oneself and showing that image to others became a powerful cultural practice, one that continues today, from painted canvases to photographs to digital screens. The Renaissance mirror did more than reflect artists. It helped humanity recognize itself as a subject worth seeing. And that takes us to our next slide, the scientific mirror, psychology, identity, and the modern self. As mirrors became common objects rather than rare luxuries, their meaning began to shift again. By the 18th and 19th centuries, mirrors were no longer just tools for artists or symbols in folklore. They entered laboratories, clinics, and eventually everyday homes. Reflection became something ordinary, and precisely because of that, it became a subject of scientific interest. One of the most important changes occurred in psychology. In the early 20th century, researchers began to study how humans recognize themselves. The mirror became central to these studies, especially in experiments involving children and animals. The famous mirror self-recognition test examines whether an individual can identify their own reflection as self, rather than other. This ability, which develops in human children around the age of 2, is linked to self-awareness. The mirror is no longer just a surface, it becomes a test of identity. At the same time, mirrors began shaping how people related to their bodies. Seeing oneself regularly altered standards of appearance, behavior, and self-evaluation. Mirrors encourage comparison between one's current self and the ideal version, between one's appearance and that of others. What began as recognition slowly became self-judgment. This shift had consequences. Psychologists and sociologists have noted that mirrors can increase self-consciousness, influencing posture, facial expression, and even moral behavior. When people are aware of being seen, even by themselves, they tend to regulate their actions more closely. The mirror becomes an internal observer. In medicine and science, mirrors also played a technical role. They were used in optical instruments, early microscopes, telescopes, and later in technologies that extended human vision beyond natural limits. Reflection helped humans see the very small, the very distant, and eventually the invisible. But perhaps the most profound change was cultural. By the modern era, mirrors helped create the idea of a continuous, visible self, a self that could be monitored, corrected, improved, and displayed. Identity became something not only felt internally, but managed externally. This idea reaches its peak in the contemporary world. Screens, cameras, and digital reflections function as mirrors that never turn away. They follow us, record us, and sometimes define us. The reflective surface has multiplied, but the question it raises remains familiar. Who am I when I see myself? Who am I when others see me? And how much of my identity is shaped by reflection? The scientific mirror gave humans knowledge, but it also deepened an ancient tension between knowing oneself and watching oneself too closely. And that takes us to our next segment, mirrors on the move, when cars learn to look back. The arrival of mirrors in automobiles marked another turning point in how humans extended their vision beyond natural limits. Early cars had no mirrors at all. Drivers simply turned their heads or relied on passengers to warn them about what was behind. That changed in 1911 when race car driver Ray Harun attached a small mirror to his vehicle during the first Indianapolis 500. The mirror allowed him to see competitors behind him without carrying a riding mechanic, a common practice at the time. Harun won the race, and the idea proved revolutionary. By the 1910s and 1920s, rear view mirrors began appearing as aftermarket accessories, and soon manufacturers started offering them as standard equipment. In 1921, American inventor Elmer Berger patented one of the first commercially successful rear view mirrors, helping normalize the idea that seeing behind oneself was not a luxury but a necessity. Side view mirrors followed, gradually becoming common by the mid 20th century as traffic increased and driving became faster and more complex. What began as a simple reflective surface became a critical safety technology, transforming mirrors from tools of self reflection into instruments of survival. In cars, mirrors no longer ask, "Who am I?" They ask, "What's coming?" And that takes us to our next segment, endless reflections, screens, surveillance, and the black mirror. In the modern world, mirrors no longer exist only on walls. They exist in screens, smartphones, laptops, video calls, security cameras, and social media platforms. All these have multiplied reflection far beyond glass. Today, people encounter their own image constantly, recorded, filtered, edited, shared, and stored. This is a new kind of mirror. Unlike traditional mirrors, digital reflections do not disappear when we step away. They persist, they circulate, they can be replayed, evaluated, and compared long after the moment has passed. Reflection has become data. This change helps explain why the British television series Black Mirror resonates so strongly with modern audiences. The title itself refers to the dark surface of inactive screens, phones, tablets, televisions, which faintly reflect our faces back at us. These screens function as mirrors, but distorted ones. They show us not only how we look, but how we are watched, measured, remembered, and judged. In many episodes of Black Mirror, technology amplifies traits that already exist: vanity, fear of rejection, obsession with visibility, and the desire for control. The mirror does not create these impulses, it reveals them. Psychologically, constant exposure to one's own image increases self awareness, but not always self understanding. Studies suggest that frequent visual self monitoring can heighten anxiety and dissatisfaction, especially when images are filtered, curated, and compared to idealized standards. The mirror becomes an evaluator. At the same time, reflection has entered systems of power. Facial recognition software, biometric identification, and surveillance cameras turn faces into searchable information. In this context, being seen is no longer optional, and reflection is no longer private. The mirror watches back. This brings the story full circle. Ancient cultures feared mirrors because they believed reflections held spiritual power. Modern societies trust mirrors because they believe in technology. Yet both perspectives recognize the same truth: reflection changes behavior. People adjust their expressions on video calls. They rehearse identities for photographs. They become aware not just of who they are, but of how they appear and to whom. Black Mirror does not predict the future, it exaggerates the present. By pushing familiar technologies to their ethical limits, it asks the same question mirrors have always asked humanity, only louder. What happens when seeing ourselves becomes unavoidable? In a world filled with screens, the challenge is no longer learning to recognize one's reflection. It is learning how to live without being defined by it. And that takes us to our final reflection, our closing reflection: learning to look away. And in this picture, we can see an image from movie Matrix. Remember when Neo touches this strange mirror and it becomes part of it. At the beginning of this story, humans encountered themselves by accident. Remember, a still pool of water, a dark piece of polished stone, a fleeting image that disappeared as soon as it appeared. Seeing oneself was rare, uncertain, and powerful. Over time, mirrors became clearer. Glass replaced metal. Reflection became reliable. Artists used mirrors to discover individuality. Scientists used them to understand light. Psychologists use them to study the mind. And today, mirrors surround us. They glow, they record, they remember. We live in a world where reflection is constant, not only in glass, but in screens that watch us as we watch them. The ancient mystery of the mirror has not disappeared, it has simply changed form. What once raised questions about the soul now raises questions about identity, privacy, and control. Throughout history, mirrors have always done more than show faces. They have shaped behavior, they have influenced belief, they have taught humans how to see themselves and sometimes how to judge themselves. From myths that warned against obsession to Renaissance painters who studied their own features, to modern stories like Black Mirror that exaggerate our dependence on reflection, the message has remained surprisingly consistent. Looking at oneself is never neutral. The mirror can offer knowledge, it can offer understanding, but it can also narrow identity to appearance alone. Perhaps this is why mirrors have always inspired both fascination and fear. They remind us that the self is visible, but not fully knowable. And maybe the most important lesson mirrors offer is not how to look more closely, but when to stop looking. Because beyond every reflection, there is still a world that cannot be captured on glass or screens. And beyond every image of ourselves, there is always more than what can be seen. Okay, thank you so much for spending this time with me on Tuning and Speak Up, the podcast from Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. I hope you enjoyed our journey on the invention of the mirror and discover how even the most ordinary things can carry deep cultural meaning. If this episode helped you see everyday life a little differently or helped you connect language with history and culture in a new way, then this episode has done exactly what it was meant to do. Learning English is not only about grammar or vocabulary. It is also about understanding how people live, think, and express values through simple actions. This season, we will continue exploring unusual yet meaningful topics that reveal the strong connection between language, history, and daily experience. Each episode is designed to help you improve your listening skills, expand your vocabulary, and develop a deeper awareness of how culture shapes communication. If you found today's episode useful or interesting, feel free to share it with your classmates, friends, or fellow English learners. Learning becomes stronger when it is shared, discussed, and experienced together. And if you'd like to share your thoughts, reflections, or feedback, we would truly love to hear from you. Your ideas help us grow, and your voice helps shape future episodes. This podcast exists for learners like you, curious, thoughtful, and committed to improving step by step. We'll be back next week with another topic that may surprise you, make you reflect, or inspire new conversations in English. Until then, keep listening, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep exploring the world through language. And as always, keep speaking up. Until next time, thank you very much. Bye bye. Thank you, Christian.
Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, en Bogotá, Colombia, transmite UMNG Radio. UMNG Radio. Una emisora alternativa, cultural e independiente. Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Esta es UMNG Radio.